Hi, folks. You know, political issues come at us so fast and so often that we often get caught up in the day-to-day us versus them superficial side of things, and we lose sight of the deeper principles, the long-standing information that we could take with us and use at a different time when a similar issue pops up. So we here at MRCTV have decided to embark on a series of videos that offer us this opportunity to get this intellectual ammunition to take with us about some of these very important bedrock issues. And our first opportunity is to go beneath the veneer of the so-called gun control advocates. Right now, let's get into part one and look at going beneath the veneer of the gun control debate. And as you can probably tell, I'm using that term gun control for a specific reason, because that is where we start, on the surface, the rhetoric of things. And then later in this video, we'll look at some of the atrocious statistics and claims that the gun control advocates use and the things that they often miss, which really don't support their argument. So let's look at that term, gun control.
Gun control. Gun control. Gun control.
Gun control.
Gun control. Gun control.
Gun control.
What is that all about? Well, obviously, it's a prejudicial term that softens what is really happening. It is politicians attempting to attenuate your right to self-defense by passing statutes. Well, this is the sort of thing that we can recognize very quickly. And it's the sort of thing that the gun control advocates often don't want us to see. And those of us who oppose gun control, well, we are often depicted as troglodytes who somehow don't see the glorious dawn of their society where their reasonable gun control laws will somehow make the world safer. They also try to explain to us that the presence of guns in the country will make us more dangerous, that the gun culture is a hazard.
You know, if you are trying to keep people paying dues and supporting your organization, you want to keep them upset. Mm-hmm. And so the NRA 30, 40 years ago was not the NRA of today.
And the only reason to modify a gun is to kill as many people as possible in as short a time as possible.
It's hard to explain how dangerous it feels when I walk into my school. It doesn't matter that there are policemen there. There's no possible way to protect it. Why don't we just cut it off at the source and take away these semi-automatic weapons?
All of us need to demand a Congress brave enough to stand up to the gun lobby's lies. All of us need to stand up and protect its citizens. All of us need to demand governors and legislators and businesses do their part to make our communities safer.
Let's look at the first claim. Well, as I've noted previously, the gun control advocates really don't have much to stand on when it comes to the efficacy of their statutes to stop people who are intent on killing people and breaking those laws against murder from acquiring firearms. Indeed, it seems as if the statutes which prevent law-abiding citizens from getting firearms don't seem to stop the people who are not intent on abiding by the law. So, for example, some of the most awful school shootings in the nation's history have seen the perpetrators break numerous gun laws.
Regulations aren't going to do it. We need a law.
The gun statutes did not stop the shooter in Newtown, Connecticut. The gun statutes did not stop the shooter in Parkland, Florida. The gun statutes did not stop Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris in 1999 when they broke 17 gun laws in the Columbine shooting.
Columbine would not have been prevented by more gun control. The fact of the matter is, nobody likes to talk about, is all the gun control laws already on the books that these kids broke, and the person who sold them firearms broke. None of them prevented Columbine.
The initiatives that the president and a lot in Washington and the lobbyists are trying to pass are going to be more of a detriment than a help. They're not protecting the kids. They're infringing on, law-abiding citizens from protecting themselves. and they're really they're taking away from what really needs to happen.
In fact, if we take it outside the schools and we go to things like cities.
Mr. President, if I may, I'd like to use Chicago, your hometown, a city that has some of the strictest gun laws in the nation, a city that for decades and still is under Democratic control, a city that has an outrageous and even embarrassing murder rate as my first example. Why can't we round up these thugs, these drug dealers and gang members, and hold them accountable for their actions, or allow the good people in Chicago access to firearms to protect themselves?
The gun statutes in Chicago don't stop the people intent on committing gun crimes. For some reason, the statutes don't stop the demand. Indeed, it's kind of something that we have observed with black markets. Well, we can even take it to outside of schools, outside of cities. Let's look at Las Vegas. Stephen Paddock, the shooter in Las Vegas in 2017, broke gun laws by changing his firearms. Did that stop him? Let's look at the other side of it. Will their gun laws actually make a nation safer? Well, we're often told that in Australia, when they passed stringent gun bans in 1996,
there was a huge response to the last amnesty and buyback in 1996 after a gunman killed 35 people at a tourist attraction in Tasmania.
The nation became safer. There was less violent crime. There's just one problem with that. It's not true.
No more scenes like this. That's the Australian government's aim as it starts a 3-month gun amnesty. The manager of this Sydney cafe and a customer were killed. It happened after 18 people were held hostage during a standoff back in 2014. The gunman used an unregistered shotgun to terrorise his victims.
For 3 years following the 1996 Australia gun ban, violent crime, including gun crime, rose. In fact, it rose so precipitously that violent crime levels did not return to pre-1996 levels until 10 years later, when, in fact, people who wanted to arm themselves turned to the black market and started to rearm themselves.
But there's also concern over the rising number of unregistered firearms. It's estimated there are 260,000 illegal guns in Australia.
It's feared many of the weapons are falling into the hands of organised crime networks. The government wants to stem the supply of firearms.
This is only one part of a wider strategy, but the whole idea behind the amnesty is to reduce the number of guns in the black and the grey markets. We don't want a large pool of unregistered guns in Australia because those guns could fall into the wrong hands.
Unlike last time, there's no money being offered in this amnesty. The Australian gun lobby say it's unlikely to reduce crime.
If you're offering up an amnesty for people who have a criminal inclination to come and hand in a firearm, what is their motivation for doing that? If they've acquired a firearm illegally, they clearly intend to use it for criminal purposes. They're hardly likely to just line up at the police station and surrender that firearm.
What about places like, England? Well, when England passed its stringent gun ban in 1997, yes, you got it, violent crime and gun crime increased dramatically. How about in other places? Well, let's look at what one person has written about this. Ryan McMacken has written for the Mises Institute, and he noted that in Ireland between 1972 and 2014, after they passed a massive gun ban, they saw a near doubling of violent crime. And in Canada, they saw a similar rise after they passed a vaunted and wonderful so-called gun control law.
After a long weekend of deadly gun violence in the city, Toronto's mayor is promising to get tough. More police surveillance cameras and more officers to combat gun violence. Many guns used in crimes are first sold and bought legally in Canada.
And then diverted either through being stolen or it was intentionally bought with the idea that they would share it with somebody else.
So some interesting data from the Toronto Police. In 2014, there were 180 gun occurrences, which the police define as incidents where a person discharges a firearm and shoots it at somebody else. This year in 2018, we're already at 200 recorded such occurrences. So we're quickly outpacing the number that we saw just a few years ago. And this is a trend that we've seen over the last couple years.
And in fact, there's something very interesting about governments not wanting people to know this information, or the flip side of it, which is that more guns see less crime. A researcher named Gary Kleck recently discovered that the United States government's Center for Disease Control actually suppressed a study that showed that American citizens stop crimes with guns 3.6 times more often than they engage in crimes with guns. Very interesting, and we have to tip our hat to Mr. Kleck for getting that information. It's also been found that, as John Lott has written in his monumental book, More Guns, Less Crime, in areas that allow for concealed carry weapons to be held more often by people, violent crime drops precipitously and faster than in neighboring areas where they don't allow it. In fact, if you turn to the FBI's Uniform Crime Statistics between 2007 and 2011, you will see that during a period of high purchases for guns, not just concealed carry firearms, but just guns in the United States, violent crime dropped precipitously.
The FBI says these are not statistical flukes. Nationwide, violent crime is down sharply across all categories. Murder down 5.7%. Rape just over 5%. Robbery down more than 7.5%. And assault almost 6%.
This was a period when, in places like England, places like Australia, and in Canada, violent crime was increasing. So what does that tell us? It tells us that the argument on the statistical side and the rhetorical side doesn't work for the gun grabbers. Which brings us to the intro for part 2 of this series, to look at another area where the gun grabbers try to make an argument. That is on the constitutional side, the historical side here in the United States. When we return, we'll investigate that side of it, look at contemporaneous wording of the Founding Fathers, and what the Constitution actually says. And please do share this with your friends, and feel free to return to this, because we're hoping that it will provide you with some intellectual ammunition that you can take with you. For now, don't forget to like and subscribe, and to hit that little button. If you're on YouTube, the little bell will tell you when new videos pop up at MRCTV. For MRCTV, I'm Gardner Goldsmith. Greetings, and welcome back to this part 2 of our 3-part series going beneath the veneer of so-called gun control. In our first video, we got to explain that oftentimes political stories come at us so fast that it becomes an us versus them battle, and we never get the opportunity to really get some intellectual ammunition to take with us to actually understand the principles underlying something. And that's what this series is all about. So here in part 2, let's move beyond some of the rhetoric and statistical legerdemain that some of the so-called gun controllers would like to use out there, and let's dig down into what the Constitution actually says. Let's find out what the Founding Fathers thought about the Second Amendment. Hi folks, I'm Gardner Goldsmith for MRCTV, and you know, many pushers of this wonderfully deceptive and dangerous euphemism called gun control often don't even bother to try to amend the United States Constitution to make it say what they would like to allow the government to do. Instead, they just read into the United States Constitution anything they desire. So why should the Founding Fathers have bothered writing it in the first place? Why bother putting an amendment process into it? Well, let's look at the actual wording of the Constitution that seems to be so problematic for the gun controllers out there, and find out what the Founding Fathers really thought. The Second Amendment reads, quote, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." end quote. And of course, the action part of the Second Amendment comes in the second clause. The second clause strictly prohibits any government, the federal government, any state governments, local or county governments, from infringing in any way on the individual right to keep and bear arms, to buy, sell arms, ammunition, anything like that. Verboten, hands off. And of course, this principle is ancient. The recognition of the principle goes all the way back to Aristotle. Over 300 years before Christ, Aristotle actually said, quote, "Those who possess and can wield arms are in a position to decide whether the Constitution is to continue or not," end quote. Now, Aristotle understood that despotism came at the hands of the armed state when the civilian population was disarmed. Indeed, even the Roman statesman Cicero said, quote, "There exists a law inborn in our hearts that if our lives are endangered by plots or violence or armed robberies, any and every method of protecting ourselves is morally right," end quote. And what did the founders themselves had to say? Well, let's turn to one of them, James Madison. James Madison noted, quote, "The advantage of being armed, which the Americans possess over the people of most every other nation, forms a barrier against the enterprise of ambition. Kingdoms of Europe are afraid to trust the people with arms," end quote. Of course, Patrick Henry in 1788 stated at the Virginia Convention a very simple and very powerful sentence. Quote, "The great object is that every man be armed," end quote. And George Mason wrote this, quote, "To disarm people is the best and most effectual way to enslave them," end quote. The actions of the British government at Lexington and Concord during the Revolutionary era reflect just how important it was for the despots to try to seize arms. We all know what the Brits were trying to do. Indeed, century after century of human history has shown that to disarm the citizens is the first step towards destroying their lives and taking their property. It's happened from Lenin to Stalin to Hitler to Mao, all over the world. Despots first disarmed the citizenry. So the lesson's clear about firearms. The principle of self-defense through the use of a firearm was supposed to be protected by the Second Amendment, not infringed upon by agents of that very government. But what of the second weak argument that some of the gun grabbers might employ? The idea that the first clause of the Second Amendment refers to a militia, which is known in their eyes today as the National Guard. Well, it's very clear if we don't just listen to Patrick Henry, who said the object was that every man be armed. Well, all we have to do is look at things like Antonin Scalia's Supreme Court decision in the 2007 Heller case. And in that, Mr. Scalia explicitly said that by looking at contemporaneous accounts of the founders, it was understood to be an individual right, not a group right.
Look, what the Constitution does, those provisions especially that guarantee individual rights, it takes certain matters out of the background rule of democracy, which is the majority rules. Now, there are exceptions to that, and most of them are in the Bill of Rights. The majority won't rule about speech, about religion, about quartering troops in homes, and so forth. Every one of those things is taken out of democratic self-government. And whenever you leave it up to the courts to read in a new exception, you're leaving it up to the courts to limit the scope of self-government.
And all we have to do is use simple logic. There's no such thing as a right for a group because groups are composed of individuals, and rights are only associated with individuals. We don't need to do anything else. Of course, we need to watch out for our rights because, in fact, even though many people applauded Justice Scalia's decision in that 2007 Heller case, unfortunately, at the very end of it, Justice Scalia wrote something that actually puts our rights at risk. And in part 3 of this series, we'll tell you about that mistake and why it's so important. And we'll also look at some of the logical arguments for and against the gun grabbers. So thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And don't forget, if you're watching on YouTube, to hit the little bell, because that will tell you when new videos have popped up from MRCTV. For MRCTV, I'm Gardner Goldsmith. Hi everyone, I'm Gardner Goldsmith for MRCTV, here with part 3 of our look beneath the veneer of so-called gun control. You know, in parts 1 and 2, we had the opportunity to look at the rhetoric of the so-called gun control backers, the statistics that don't really back the backers, and we had the chance to read the wording of the Founding Fathers and find out what they really meant when they wrote the Second Amendment. Now, to wrap things up, I'd like to offer you some logical arguments that seem to show that those people who say they want less gun violence on the streets by passing gun control laws are actually engaging in threats of gun violence. And I'd like to conclude by looking at where we stand today regarding our rights, the Constitution, and the courts. Hi everyone. To close things off in this part 3 of our look beneath the veneer of so-called gun control, I'd like to offer you some information that you might be able to take with you, adjust, or just use straight out. Let's say you run into a person who supports so-called gun control laws because they want less gun violence and threats on the streets. Okay, well, why not pose them a series of questions? Almost like you're in an Aristotelian conversation, a syllogism, you might say. The first question would be, is possession of something a violent act? And of course the answer is no, it's not a violent act. It doesn't harm anyone else to possess something. That's fairly clear. The next question is, okay, does possession connote intent? What do we mean by that? Well, of course, we're all separate individuals. So even though we might try to take a guess or an educated guess as to why someone bought something or made something or got something from someone else through trade, we can't say for another person why he or she bought that thing or possesses that thing. It's not our place, okay? We can see that. Someone might have a pair of scissors, but we don't know whether they're going to use them for a theater prop or put them next to their bed for defensive purposes or to cut things with it day to day for work. We don't know, and it's not our place to tell somebody that we do. Okay, now, even if we could say that you could connote intent from possession, then the gun grabbers would be in a bad position as well. Because as we've seen, the Centers for Disease Control actually did a study, which they hid, by the way, that showed that American civilians use guns 3.6 times more often to stop crimes than to engage in crimes. So in fact, if they thought that possession connoted intent and they wanted to get the government to force people to do things, then they would want the government to force people to own more firearms. Hello, Switzerland. Okay? Now, finally, ask them this question. If they are in favor of politicians passing statutes that will punish people for owning, buying, possessing, trading, anything like that, guns or ammunition, then who will actually execute those laws and enforce them? That's right, armed agents of the state.
With 350 million guns in 65 million places, households, from Key West to Alaska, 350 million objects in 65 million places. If the federal government wanted to confiscate those objects, how would they do that?
Officials in the Chicago suburb of Deerfield have banned the possession, sale, and manufacture of assault-style weapons and large-capacity magazines. Residents have until June 13th to give them up, and if they refuse, they will face fines of up to $1,000 per day.
So, when you come right down to it, the people who support so-called gun control laws to stop gun violence on the streets are actually supportive of threats of gun violence against innocent, law-abiding people.
And the president's talking about confiscating guns like they did in Australia. Well, that's never going to happen here.
Why?
because we have a Second Amendment, and also you talk about a national registry. I mean, do we really trust the federal government to know where all the guns are, the same federal government that runs the IRS?
There's no two ways around it. And finally, I'd like to mention something about conservatives and a deceased hero from the Supreme Court for conservatives. In 2007, Justice Antonin Scalia wrote the majority decision for a Supreme Court case called District of Columbia v. Heller. His name was Richard Heller. I met Dick Heller, and I've spoken to him about this case. And it was about whether or not the right to keep and bear arms was a group right, as the leftist collectivists always tell us, or it was an individual right. Well, Justice Scalia, to his credit, spent over 60 pages explaining through contemporaneous accounts that the Founding Fathers believed it was an individual right.
Undoubtedly, some think that the Second Amendment is outmoded in a society where our standing army is the pride of our nation, where well-trained police forces provide personal security, and where gun violence is a serious problem. That is perhaps debatable, but what is not debatable is that it is not the role of this court to pronounce the Second Amendment extinct.
Okay, to his credit, great job. But he didn't really need to do that. As I mentioned before, he could have just used logic to say that group is just a word applied to an assemblage of individuals who always retain their individual natural rights. It's always reducible to the individual. That's all. Groups can't have rights because they're just composed of individuals. Unfortunately, he didn't do that, and he went a little bit further. See, at the end of the Heller decision, Justice Scalia said this.
Like most rights, the Second Amendment right is not unlimited. It is not a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever, in any manner whatsoever, and for whatever purpose.
And that is absolutely wrong. Unfortunately, after spending all that time defending the individual right to keep and bear arms, Justice Scalia not only undercut the individual right to keep and bear arms, saying that, well, yeah, it's a right, but everybody knows rights can be attenuated. Wrong, wrong, wrong. He actually undercut the very concept of rights itself. And now it's being revealed because the courts themselves are starting to use that conclusion to the Heller case as an excuse to further attenuate the right to keep and bear arms. It's very sad. It's a sad legacy for the close of Justice Scalia's career. But it's something that we have to remember. Even people that are generally seen as heroes for the Constitution can do things that can be very dangerous to our rights. And perhaps it's a lesson for us to learn that we can never trust agents of the state, any of them. The government itself is always a threat to our rights. Just something to remember. Thank you so much for watching this series. And don't forget, feel free to like, comment, anything you like, because we always love to get feedback here. For MRCTV, I'm Gardner Goldsmith.